Hello internet, welcome to Something Theory, and today I got a video that's been sitting in my backlog for a good year now. So as we all know from my award-winning video, Ravenfield is the Gmod of shooters, so naturally it should be a complete sandbox with no active lore, right? Well, no. After inspecting the maps, promo art, and using some educated guessing, we can actually piece together some really basic lore that does exist in Ravenfield. Firstly, we need to start off with the history of this world before we discuss anything. And luckily, the Halloween event from 2019 gives us a lot of hints in the form of these scrolls. I'll put them on screen so you can read them for yourself, but otherwise, here is my interpretation. A long-ass time ago, there was a big empire that likely encompassed much of the maps we play in the game. This empire was probably, in fact almost certainly, united between both Eagle and Raven, but at some point tensions began to rise between the two groups, seemingly due to corruption and greed, and as a result opposition groups began to emerge that threatened whoever was in control, and unable to settle their differences, Eagle and Raven split off. And that led to a non-stop state of war between the two factions. So yeah, really simple lore hidden in stupidly fancy words. And with some further examination of both the Halloween event and two maps, I think we can even pinpoint what party played what role in this story. Firstly, let's look at Temple because it has Raven's red all over it. The temple walls and sarcophagus are lined with red, and even these banners near the wall have red. To go further, Raven also spawns on the altar within the temple. Now hold on, I hear some of you typing. Red is just a popular color and there isn't anywhere else Raven could realistically spawn. Is there any real evidence? Yes. Look at the ghost we fight in the Halloween event and take note of his cloak. Because if we hop over to Mountain Range and look at the Raven statue on the map, he appears to be wearing the exact same cloak as the ghost. And to boot, he's wielding a sword and shield, which is a sign of defense. And Raven is defending on Temple, so to me, the connection is clear. Staying on this map, if we go to the other end, we see a hunky eagle with a giant hammer. Not a very welcoming image, so I reckon this all but confirms Eagle were the rulers of this aforementioned empire. And the reason the Raven statue has a sword and shield is because they feel they are defending themselves from Eagle. And most likely from Eagle's perspective, they are quashing a dangerous set of individuals who are threatening their emperor. And because Eagle obviously has the power here, out of fear for their lives if their identities were discovered, some Ravens began wearing cloaks. It wasn't a fashion choice, it was a life-saving choice. Now hold on, why am I so convinced that Mountain Range and Temple are connected? Well, because they are in the conquest mode and they're right next to each other, which leads me to think the temple is just higher up in the mountain range. So in the history, Ravens must have fled to these mountains and carved these statues to tell their story. And the temple, seeing as there's a big ass coffin in the center of it, I reckon this is the ghost's resting place, and whoever he was important to Raven. And finally stepping into the present, we see for ourselves the war is still ongoing. Now I'm sure there have been pauses between the wars and various peace deals, but it's evident none of them last. So going back to the conquest map, how is the current war going? Well, firstly, we need to answer if this is taking place at the start of the war, and for simplicity's sake, I'm just gonna say yes it is. So taking note of that, this map we start with is actually pretty interesting. For one, most of the maps aren't actually claimed, and to our right we see Raven starts off with more controlled area than Eagle does. But this does raise a question. What are these non-claim maps actually representing? A border, perhaps? Personally, because they show signs of being inhabited, I think these are most likely disputed territories, and the reason we don't see formalized claims is because there is an ongoing truce. And from an educated guess, it isn't too crazy to think both Eagle and Raven were breaking their truce to extract resources from these lands. Looking at what both formally have claimed, Raven has what essentially amounts to a wasteland and the Falkland Islands, whilst Eagle just has a swamp and an island with a missile silo. It doesn't take a genius to see that these are unfavorable outcomes for both sides, and the conflict resuming was an inevitability. And since Eagle has the first move, it's pretty obvious regardless who started this war back up. Now interestingly, Raven having more officialized claims does suggest they were winning the war. Why is that noteworthy? Because by all accounts, Eagle is significantly wealthier than Raven. Like, it's not even close. So what do I have to substantiate this claim? Well, I introduced to you the Spec Ops mode and story campaign. Given the fact the advisor appears in both of these, plus Conquest, I think it's safe to assume that their stories are connected and canonical. So with that in mind, booting into a game of Spec Ops, we immediately see what Eagle is capable of. For one, Talon has literal high-end body armor that isn't on their normal grunts, and second, Eagle has access to eyes. She's an intelligence officer who can identify enemy officers, relay enemy positions, warn you of upcoming vehicles, and probably do a whole bunch more that we don't see in-game. Which is insane because it means that Eagle has a fully fledged intelligence network that is perfectly accurate because Eyes is never wrong. On the contrary, if you play as Raven in Spec Ops, you're gonna quickly find they have no such luxury. Hell, the Raven Spec Ops don't even get better armor, they are literally just the same as normal grunts. So given the significant difference in capabilities, it's no wonder Raven's leadership just kept hiding their identities like their comrades of old. The Raven soldiers don't even know who their CEO is, likely so if they get captured they can't spill the beans. Their CEOs also say as little as possible because even how you talk can identify who you are. Another key difference between Eagle and Raven in Spec Ops is the outcome that occurs in the event the player dies. In the event you meet your demise as Eagle, the advisor will have the rest of Talon retreat and regroup. Raven, on the other hand, will continue to fight, and this to me makes it evident that they cannot afford losses. As we've seen so far, Eagle is way better off than Raven, so they can afford to do things like retreat and just tank a loss. Which means maybe Eagle wasn't actually losing the hypothetical last war I talked about. Maybe they were actually just taking a temporary hiatus to better prepare for their next moves. But let's not get lost in the hypothetical again, because using the story mode and the promo art, we can actually get a pretty good guess as to what weapons both factions use. Right off the bat, in the story mission, I think we can pretty much slam dunk confirm that the Patriot is the primary weapon of Eagle's special forces. For one, every member of Talon has one, and two, an interesting consistency in the Spec Ops is there's a special cutscene if you select the Silenced Patriot as Eagle. So for that alone, I think this one's a pretty easy confirmation. Now heading over to Raven, one would assume their weapons are randomly generated, but that's not actually the case. I went through, and I shit you not, 30 games, and I counted every weapon Raven has in the first two parts. I'm not gonna bore you by saying all the numbers, but my data's on screen for you here now. As we can see, there's a slight bias towards the RK-44. Now, on its own, this isn't indicative of much, but when I originally did the data for this video a year ago, the results were actually way different. So, I decided to double check my work and went back to EA29 and counted yet another 30 games, and these were the results. Again, the boring stuff's on screen, but look how biased the weapon roster is. Now, why did this change so much between versions? I couldn't tell you, but I will be using this to further my agenda. So hear me out. What if the Garrett and RK are the primary weapons of Raven, but as the war progresses, they begin capturing the Patriot and using it more? And for Raven to capture large quantities of Patriots, that must mean the Patriot is Eagle's primary battle rifle as a whole. I can even take this a step further, because if we go to Conquest mode, there is a weapons development screen. Now obviously this is going to be balanced for gameplay, but it still shows very directly the Garrett and RK are early weapons. And because we've already confirmed that Eagle are rich bitches, then we can also conclude logically in the actual lore they would have Patriots develop for most of their men, whilst Raven is lagging behind with RKs and Garretts.
Okay, but what about all the other weapons in Ravenfield you're missing?
Okay, funny voice I just made up. We need to turn to official artworks of the game for that. Starting off with this very busy image, we can see the advisor is equipped with the Automatico, Eyes has the misfortune of having a Quicksilver, and these nameless grunts have the Signal DMR, a Greaser, and the SI and D7. Let's start with the Signal DMR, because if you paid attention earlier, you'll notice it's all around a very rare weapon. I have a theory for that, but we need to go back to the Conquest Weapons chart. So hear me out. Whilst this chart is extending vertically for gameplay purposes, what if, in reality, it's actually more horizontal? The Signal DMR could very well be an experimental weapon that got dropped in favor of the Patriot. After all, the Signal can't be equipped with grenade launchers or silencers, whereas the Patriot can. In fact, the explanation of the Patriot even says it's a new approach to weapons manufacturing that allows it to have different attachments. So using this logic, the reason the Signal DMR is so rare in the story is because it was probably never a common weapon to begin with. As for the other weapons in this image, I think they have simple explanations. Starting with Eyes, our beloved intel gatherer, she has the Quicksilver. Using the Conquest chart, we can see this too is an earlier weapon that's also stealth-based. Given the fact Eyes doesn't confront the enemy directly, it makes sense that she would be using an older weapon, as her role doesn't necessitate immediate change. Remember, in the real world, the militaries very often field some units with extremely outdated equipment because updating every unit at once simply isn't feasible. So with that in mind, even though the Greaser isn't on the Conquest chart, I think it's safe to assume it's an earlier weapon as well. In real life, the Grease Gun was predominantly given to tankers and soldiers in support roles, so I could totally see this being the same in Eagle's army. After all, those roles don't necessitate hasty change either. I'm also making this assumption because in the real world, the Grease Gun is a piece of cheap junk. As a result, I would take a guess the Greaser is also probably pretty common in Raven's army. And last on this image, we have two pistols, which are simply sidearms, so I'm not going to waste my time going over them because they're not going to be used much in frontline combat anyways. The advisor especially is not going to be finding herself fighting on the front. If she does, then something's gone pretty wrong. And the last few images I have are rather uneventful. All we see is an Eagle Grunt with a Slam R, which is a shockingly late development weapon. Funny enough, using my own method, that would actually mean Raven probably doesn't have many anti-tank weapons. And if they do, it's likely the Dagger and Thumper of all things. And lastly, we have these pieces of art for the game modes. And immediately, we see a sniper rifle and a shotgun that just don't exist in the game at all. So obviously, we can't count those, but there is an Eagle with a Garrett here. The poor bastard must be from a reserve unit. As for the weapons not shown in the promo arts or elsewhere we've looked, I'm not going to waste your time going over them. I think my methodology using the Conquest weapon development feature is pretty self-explanatory, so going off that and using the new weapon rarity feature, this is what I believe Eagle's canonical arsenal would be. And here's Raven's for comparison. Now as for the vehicles, which undoubtedly I can see someone trying to comment about now, I don't have anything to say. There aren't enough vehicles in Ravenfield to really put together some lore with them. However, we do see Ravens in possession of an aircraft carrier in Canyon. They also pick you up in a helicopter in Spec Ops, so I think it's safe to just assume that Raven has access to the same vehicles as Eagle, but probably just in way less quantity. And with that, I've said everything I need to. To quickly recap and put everything here in a more digestible format, Raven and Eagle seem to be engaged in a forever war. One could even say a race war. In spite of formally controlling more territory, Eagle in every aspect has the upper hand against Raven. They have a strong intelligence network, better weapons and gear, they can tank losses. Whereas Raven's leadership meanwhile has to cloak their identities because if they don't, then Talon's just gonna single-handedly pick them off one by one like they do with the comms officers in Spec Ops. And to make matters worse, Raven also sports significantly worse gear and their weaponry lags behind, all whilst having no formal intelligence network either. So when the war kicks back off, I think it's safe to just assume it immediately begins going well for Eagle. I would like to say more for this bit, but there just isn't enough to make any more definitive guesses. The attack on the Citadel in the story mission is clearly not the actual end objective of Eagle. It may be a major point of interest, but the story mode implies it's not the end goal for the war. So really, you're just gonna have to use your imagination with how this all pans out. So with that, what are your guys' thoughts on the Ravenfield lore? Did I make any sense? Do you have your own grandiose ideas? Well, put it all in the comments below, because I'm sure this video has plenty of flaws some nerd can type out against me to say this video sucks. And to end this video, I want to give my thanks to Nolberg. Even though he seems to have just up and disappeared, when I originally made the plans for this video, he was a big part of helping me out, and that shouldn't go uncredited.